is nothing. Only warm primordial blackness.
Why did you cause this?
An inordinate amount of time passes.
Your wristwatch. The alarm chimes, soft but insistent. You know it like the back of the hand it clings to.
The stench of liquor rises from your mouth, and with it, an ungodly headache.
It is everything. The road and the home. An escape from the cold, old and safe. A promise of the hot, new and dangerous.
A fiery streak penetrates your skull, trying to force your eyes open. It's a sound, a clarion call from hell.
You're on a path in the woods, and at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't...
Disco Elysium is one of my favorite things ever. It's not necessarily for everyone, but it seems most who play it consider it an absolute masterpiece. So after it came out, the team that made it quickly fell to infighting, backstabbing, and a scattering of key figures who went off to start their own competing projects, like the authentic leftists they are. 3 major members of the team, including the game's director and main creator of the game's setting, were let go shortly after the release of the final cut, with a few others leaving over the subsequent couple years. Then, in October of 2024, a flurry of successor projects were announced, and there are now 5 different splinter groups competing for the title of Disco Elysium Successor. The first of these games to get a trailer was XXX Nightshift, and yeah, that sure looks like Disco Elysium, but again. Which of the 5 studios will make the most worthy successor? How many will dissolve before releasing anything? I don't know. But they're not the only ones trying to carry the torch of Disco Elysium. The game was massively successful after all, and its popularity guaranteed that plenty of fans unrelated to the original production would try their hands at putting their own spin on it. Take Esoteric Ebb, for example, a game that is very blatantly adapting the Disco Elysium UI and overall narrative style to a Dungeons & Dragons system and fantasy setting. Maybe this could be good. But moving away from what is yet to be, I believe that we already have 2 very strong contenders for the title of Disco Elysium's successor. 2022's NORCO and 2023's Slay the Princess are both fantastic narrative experiences that I found strikingly similar to Disco Elysium while still being very much themselves. This is something any prospective successor must find a way to do. Follow up what made Disco so good while maintaining its own sense of self, its own identity. Disco Elysium was an isometric, dialogue-driven RPG about a murder investigation in a post-communist slum neighborhood in a fully fictional world that resembles the latter half of our own 20th century. NORCO is an adventure game about a young woman returning home after her mother's death to look for her brother, set in a fictionalized sci-fi version of Norco, Louisiana. Slay the Princess is a choice-driven visual novel about a fantasy princess in a forest cabin who is allegedly about to end the world. They're all great, all themselves, but all share certain sensibilities and concepts. So, let's get into them. I'll start without spoilers for NORCO before doing a spoiler section, but Slay the Princess can't really be analyzed without spoilers the whole time, I feel. And free-firing spoilers for Disco Elysium will be throughout. Consider yourself warned. There is a place by New Orleans. It is run by an extension of Shell Oil, the New Orleans Refining Company. NORCO. Only a few thousand people live there. The town is within a stretch of the Mississippi River that's nicknamed Cancer Alley because of all the petrochemical plants. The oil facility in NORCO has exploded twice. This is a choking, dying town in the shadow of a monstrous fossil fuel industry behemoth that sets the skies on fire. None of that was world building. This is all real. NORCO, the game, takes place in a fictionalized version of this town, in a grimy near future where not much artistic license is needed to make the place a dystopia, but there are robots, brain uploading, and artificial intelligences that are more than just resource-guzzling, hallucinating chatbots. Instead of Shell Oil, the company that owns the refinery is named SHIELD. America has been ravaged by vaguely defined civil wars. If the world isn't ending, it's sure doing a convincing impression. The plot follows Kay, a young woman who grew up in the town and ran away to wander war-torn America. She returns home when her mother, Catherine, dies, to find that her brother Blake has gone missing. Her quest to track him down involves investigating what her mother was up to during her final days, which we actually get to play out when we switch perspectives to Catherine. Kay explores NORCO while Catherine's journey takes her around New Orleans proper. You meet many strange people, see vivid slices of how human beings eke out livings with, as developer Yutz has put it, a dragon living in their backyard. And all the while, a strange ditchman is obsessed with his beliefs about the supposed bloodline of Jesus Christ. You could say this game is all about the sacred and the profane.
Very observant. The sacred and the profane.
You know you're in for a wild ride when a game opens with a content warning for blasphemy. Right off the bat, the hopeless setting ravaged by the abuses of capital is reminiscent of how Disco Elysium depicts Revachol, but that alone would only be a tangential connection. The game has a similar tone of absurdist melancholy, with entertainingly off-kilter characters like the aforementioned Ditchman, Drug Santa, the entire cult of disaffected young men who take on the name Garrett, and the overconfident detective LeBlanc. LeBlanc feels decently similar to Harry Dubois, and with Kay's much flatter, more straightforward persona, one could reductively describe their frequent interactions as a role reversal of Disco Elysium where you get to play as Kim Kitsuragi. But that is not a fair comparison. Kay is characterized far differently from Kitsuragi and Dubois, as someone who appears to be more of a blank slate. Even her appearance is blank, her only features a scribbled frowny face overshadowed emptiness in place of an expression. You, as the player, get to define certain aspects of her personality and past, including the exact nature of her feelings towards her late mother and how she feels about the hometown she ran away from. You can play her as directly confrontational or a little more appeasing, but she is always a rough, disaffected girl who ran away from home, speaks in short sentences, and is more than willing to throw herself into danger to accomplish her goals. Not everyone would team up with an eco-terrorist to break into the old plantation house headquarters of an oil refinery, but Kay is such a person, and most elements of her aimless past are immutable, discoverable by looking at memory-prompting segments of the town. She is always the kind of person who left home to wander war zones. You get to decide whether or not she prayed about it. Kay is more than a blank slate, but has the vibe of one, and the literal appearance of one. It's a far cry from Harry Dubois, who is dangerously leaking personality even though we have much more freedom to shift his character. That's not to say Dubois is better than Kay as a protagonist for that reason, or that NORCO fails where Disco Elysium succeeded. It's going for a different approach. I like Dubois more, as I'm sure most would, but Kay brings a specific meaning to NORCO that Dubois never could. Kay is almost a black hole of characterization. Not to say that it is absent from her, but that her personality and history is established by taking in everything around her and absorbing it into herself. Through her memories, we see the history of her town. She is a byproduct of her hopeless environment, and that product is someone stripped of a face, of an identity of her own that is not dependent on her surroundings. No wonder she ran away, hoping to find herself. Her brother Blake is similar. We get to know him not through interacting with him, we spend the whole game looking for him because he's gone missing after all, but through how Kay remembers him and how others talk about him. He is a burnout, someone with no prospects for the future. He, like his sister, has no face, but his squiggly frowny face is even rougher than hers. This is in complete contrast with their mother Catherine. She has a face, a history of her own, and extensive dialogue that the player does not necessarily choose. While picking Kay's dialogue options simply makes her say your choice, like a voiceless RPG protagonist such as the Warden from Dragon Age Origins, dialogue options for Catherine prompt her to rephrase them in her own words, like Commander Shepard from Mass Effect. If Catherine shared the facelessness of her kids, it would be most natural to interpret that as an artistic choice for the Madère family, for this blank slate that the ditch man, Pawpaw, projects his own mythology into, if that's how you interpret his beliefs at least. But no, the game draws a line between generations, demonstrating the seeming hopelessness for the future by degrading the very identities of the younger generations. This is reflected in Kenner John's cult of Garretts, whose members all dress in the same retail worker uniform and adopt the same name. It is also, perhaps, reflected in how Kay's section of the game is within the town of Norco until Act 3, while Catherine's is entirely outside of it, in New Orleans proper. The areas she visits are a little less apocalyptic than her hometown, even though the alienation has firmly taken root all over. Norco is set in the long twilight of a dying world, preoccupied primarily with how people find meaning when faced with this desolation. Shield Oil has given the town cancer, as it gave Catherine cancer. Catherine chooses to spend her final days working to build a nest egg for her children, choosing to believe in a future that neither of them may actually consider. The Garretts and Pawpaw choose their off-kilter versions of religion, their esoteric versions of Christianity that warp scripture into ego-boosting science fantasy that, rather than preaching love and charity, elevates its acolytes above the rest of the despicable masses. An all-too-familiar instance of the hopeless radicalizing into self-interested, zealous misanthropy. Now, I'm talking about Norco in the context of Disco Elysium, but to a large extent, doing so is very guy who's only ever seen Boss Baby seeing his second movie with regards to the larger, much older literary genre of Southern Gothic. I mean, in the art book for the game, the creator Yutz lists a couple major influences, including Ursula K. Le Guin and Umberto Eco, based, and Disco Elysium is not mentioned at all, which makes sense. The project began way back in 2015. The Southern Gothic genre is described by the Oxford Research Encyclopedia as follows. Southern Gothic is a mode or genre prevalent in literature from the early 19th century to this day. Characteristics of Southern Gothic include the presence of irrational, horrific, and transgressive thoughts, desires, and impulses, grotesque characters, dark humor, and an overall angst-ridden sense of alienation. While related to both the English and American Gothic tradition, Southern Gothic is uniquely rooted in the South's tensions and aberrations. That's certainly Norco. Much of it is also Disco Elysium, despite Disco drawing from post-Soviet, post-90s economic shock therapy ruins, rather than post-Civil War, post-plantation ruins. In some ways, though, Disco Elysium feels more Southern Gothic than Norco is, because of the haunt of past hope in Revachol. A big part of Southern Gothic originally was interrogating and breaking down the romanticism towards the South's antebellum era. You know, the one with all the slavery. Norco, however, contains little romanticism towards the past to deconstruct in the first place. There is a brief moment when Catherine reminisces about the old abandoned mall that the Garrett cult has taken over, but that's the only notable moment of any good old days being identified. As much as Kay's return to Norco is filled with reminiscence about the past, that reminiscence is colored with the same desolation that now permeates the present. Her home life was a struggle because of her father's death in a shield plant explosion. Her house flooded 3 times. The all-consuming machine of Shield Oil's business dominance has swallowed up the entire temporal space of Norco. It has dominated the past of its characters, has a stranglehold on the present, and it has polluted the land and people so much that it has all but obliterated the future. Those who look to the past for comfort have to look further, much further, to medieval Christendom in some cases. But the region's past with slavery is still acknowledged. A couple in-game books describe how the plantation era echoes even now, while the Shield Banquet is held in an opulent plantation house tucked within the all-consuming refinery. The plantations of yesterday have become the oil complexes of the future. But all that is to say that through its near-future setting, by adding elements of science fiction to the Southern Gothic genre, Norco expands the sense of alienation to everything. The past comes pre-torn down. There's no need for some haunting to reveal the sins of the prior world. Instead, the haunting is just loss stacked upon loss. While Southern Gothic uses rotting plantations in place of the old European castles that may or may not house vampires, Norco uses more modern modern institutions emblematic of 21st century industry. The oil refinery, an abandoned mall, a construct at the end that would be a spoiler to mention now. Despite having such a strong sense of specificity to the Louisiana coast, NORCO's Gothic traits are more broadly American. I still feel like comparisons to Disco Elysium are warranted, because even if NORCO were not developed with the intention of following up on that RPG, it is still a relative in terms of theme and sensibility. What makes this game feel so much like Disco Elysium is the way the Southern Gothic qualities of supernaturalism, dark humor, and tragically absurd characters combine with science fiction and alternate history to take aim at corporate desolation rather than antebellum desolation. And also the way the UI features scrolling dialogue to break up text blocks. A lot of the moments of heightened reality feel like Kay is walking around with a high shiver stat from Disco. There's a moment in particular that you can find if you look at her house when she thinks about the 3 times her house has flooded. And then, after going through all 3, a new option appears, predicting a 4th flood in the years to come. The 4th flood will follow a slow hurricane, and it will be a calamity. It will leave the entire region submerged as critical levees breach. There will be a massive blackout that lasts weeks. Much of the sewerage infrastructure will be damaged beyond repair. The embattled federal government will do nothing to assist. It will bankrupt the region. Small militant enclaves will form along the high ground of the Mississippi River. They will take to piracy and hijack commercial shipping vessels. Private mercenary forces will retaliate in kind. Slowly, industry will flee this hot zone. The old river control structure will collapse from neglect and sabotage. The Mississippi River will again change its course. NORCO, an old abandoned refinery town on a ghost of a river. Your house will be squatted and then razed. This power of prophecy is not exclusive to this moment, or even to Kay as a character, but because this scene is likely to be encountered early on, it infuses a mysticism to the otherwise gritty sci-fi dystopia right away that continues through the entire game, even for a Kay you do not play as devoutly Christian. And this is where we cross over into spoiler territory, if you haven't played the game and would like to experience it without knowing anything else in advance. The Strange Ditch Man ultimately takes the role of main antagonist, claiming to be an immortal man who made a promise to Jesus Christ himself to look after his descendants, whom Jesus allegedly sired, and that now Catherine, Kay, and Blake are the last of Christ's bloodline, and it's time to take them away from planet Earth via homemade rocket ship. Pawpaw's claims are obviously insane, and his unapologetic association with drugs, we never see him use any, but he certainly has a lot of connections to get some and behaves erratically, seems to discredit him. But on the other hand, he demonstrates knowledge and foresight that he should not have. In the snippets of the past where we play as Catherine, he speaks of Kay's return with specificity that we, the player, already know is accurate. The MacGuffin of this game is a strange, otherworldly orb that the Garretts, Shield, the AI Superduck, we'll get there, and Pawpaw all want, and Pawpaw claims it is an angel drawn to Catherine and Kay for their divine blood. He may be delusional, but this orb is in fact drawn to the mother and daughter in a way that it is not for anybody else. No alternative explanations are given. Maybe at least some of his ravings are true. I'm reminded of the inexplicably supernatural in Disco Elysium, the phenomenon of the Pale, Harry's possibly real, possibly delusional psychic connection with the spirit of the city itself, and the Insulindian Phasmid. While these are moments of wonder and hope in Disco Elysium, in NORCO the supernatural feels, at first glance, distinctly sinister. It is something Pawpaw and the Garretts cling to as justification for murder, kidnapping, and smug superiority. It draws the attention of Superduck and Laura St. Clair, leading to both of their deaths in spectacular flameouts that are sure to have huge repercussions. Laura will leave a power vacuum in S.H.I.E.L.D., while Superduck's decaying nodes are leaking radiation all around them. In NORCO, the supernatural is not a sign of wonder. It is at best a false hope, and at worst a siren actively leading people to their doom. Or perhaps it is more accurate to describe it as a magnet for hubris. The orb seems to really be a neutral entity, attached to the Madare family, but otherwise not doing anything specifically. It's those who try to control it and twist it for their own ends who end up destroyed by it. Despite the devastation caused by these efforts, there may be hope to be seen in the way forces of industry, technology, and reactionary occultism are all unable to wrangle the truly miraculous. It's of limited comfort to the average person, though. The orb does not topple S.H.I.E.L.D., only one executive who could be replaced. It does not repair the environmental poison spewed into Lake Pontchartrain. It in fact escalates it because the dying superduct nodes are radioactive. It does nothing to alleviate the alienation that compelled the Garretts to gather around Ken or John, and then become even more terrifyingly radical under Pawpaw's direction. It merely leaves them when their rocket fails to launch. It may be something uncontrollable, an ideal that people like Kay and Catherine wish for themselves, but it does not help on its own. Kay has to put in work to be truly uncontrollable in a way that helps others. To get the most tonally hopeful ending, where Kay frees her brother and takes the body of her mother away from the man obsessed with her family, you have to show human connection to one of the Garretts, real name Bruce. Either by proving that his father loves him or surrendering her damaged childhood monkey doll because it resembles his own, Kay can convince Bruce to abandon his post, which distracts Pawpaw long enough to free Blake. And there's LeBlanc at the end, grievously injured in the ascent up the rocket ship, whose body can either disappear, indicating survival, and confirmed as such in a recently updated ending, or remain dead. While the trigger for this seems to be unclear in the game's minimally active fan communities, his survival may be somewhat dependent on whether you go up to talk to him or ignore him. It's subtle, but these moments of human connection do create better outcomes, even in spite of the broader narrative strokes being out of your control. Then again, another possible outcome in this same scenario, probably caused by different choices made well before this moment, is for Kay to hear her mother's body possessed by Pawpaw swearing to return, and her chasing her brother into the woods instead of carrying their mother as a team. I'm not sure what causes the difference here. Also, up until this year's 1.5 update, Kay would invariably leave her town forever after the events of the game, once again abandoning her brother to wander aimlessly. Now, though, you can stay with him. I suppose hope was patched in. A newer emphasis on human connection. Technology is certainly no substitute for these bonds, not in this game. Catherine adopts the android Million after her husband's death, implicitly as a way to try to make up for this loss of connection. And Million is a member of the family, but her builder, Thomas St. Clair, has programmed specific directives into her, a hunter as she calls it. This means that even if her words in Kay's ending hallucination are accurate and she may wish otherwise, she can never truly be a part of the family, can never be a real replacement. And then there's Superduck. Superduck is a digital copy of one of Catherine's longtime friends who goes by Duck, but this copy has succumbed to total megalomania and somehow escaped into the wild. Superduck has managed to form a biological internet of sorts, using bioelectric signals in birds and trees, and has been building power through the use of his own cryptocurrency, Quackcoin. He has been hiring people like Dallas to do various errands for him, and gets Dallas and Catherine to get the orb, also called the Stone or the Messenger, from the Garretts so he can eat it. Superduck has positioned himself as a sort of savior for desperate gig workers in NORCO and New Orleans, and people like Dallas have come to rely on him for income. Catherine relies on her work for Superduck to build her nest egg for her children, only for it to all be a waste when it's revealed that her cancer was actually in remission until Superduck irradiated her by talking to her in person, and when he takes the orb into himself, his network is overloaded and his coin crashes, wiping out her earnings. Superduck represents runaway technological spread, infecting even the natural world with a desire for infinite growth, centralizing everything around it into itself until it gets too big for its britches and takes down everything that's come to depend on it when it falls. The birds Superduck has integrated with are dropping dead. Its former workers are now as destitute as they were before they came to it for help. How Duck's personality became Superduck when digitally copied is unclear, as the two have no resemblance to each other beyond the name. This is surely a result of a fault in the process. Catherine's copy is riddled with ads and barely able to comprehend what Kay and LeBlanc say to her. Once again, her efforts to use cutting-edge technology to leave something behind for her loved ones is a total failure. This game is bleak. Writing for the blog Gamers with Glasses, Yaochu B describes the darker version of the ending where Kay escapes with her brother and dead mother, only to hear Pawpaw's voice and have to chase her brother, and says, "Just like this town that seems beyond saving, there's nothing one can do to put together a broken family, a family so shattered that even an ephemeral reunion has to take place in a spaceship erected in the middle of a lake," as if the story were saying that, just like the hideous religious cult and the supernatural organisms that make up its universe, it is also a scene of impossibility. B then goes on to write, "Some have compared NORCO to Disco Elysium for their equally intoxicating dialogue and nihilist themes, yet the latter, even with all its sarcasm and skepticism, still expresses a certain belief in human community making. The equivalent of these little sparks of hope that dot Martinez's working-class landscape is almost entirely absent in NORCO's abandoned neighborhoods. It entertains the possibility of individual anarchists like Lucky living alone outside the system, while failing to imagine an eco-revolutionary collective that could build a different relationship with the environment. It invests its trust in individual detectives like LeBlanc, but cannot picture any community organization or a public institution that tries its best to pull the streets together. I see more spots of hope than B does, but I also saw a different ending in my most recent playthrough, one that certainly had some elements of it added in the 1.5 update 3 years after release, and after B's article came out. Even so, B's observation that NORCO is comparatively more hopeless than Disco Elysium remains true. Even the moment of most transcendental wonder, when Kay experiences a vision of herself in her flooding house high in the sky, seeing images of the future and getting to speak with her dead family members again, including Million, is sad. She sees a vision of what her future will be, but only a possible future if she saves Blake. This version, featuring some sense of closure at least for Blake, can be thwarted by a player choosing to leave him on the rocket ship or explode with him right after this preemptive epilogue. In the vision, Kay can speak to her father Blue, who says to her, "You just don't think that..." He looks down at the water spreading across the linoleum tiles, "that it'll get bad. But when it does, you don't think there's any other way it can be. That's what gets me." The game itself has difficulty thinking there's any other way things can be. But this vision also lets Kay look into a mirror, and for the first time in the game, the prose description gives her a face. You wipe the steam from the surface to see yourself for the first time. You have green eyes and coarse hair curled wildly at its ends. You look like your mom did at your age, in the pictures when she smiled beside Blue. There's a small scar above your left eye. You step away from the mirror, but the reflection remains. You finish drying and throw the towel into the floodwater. Dress, flip the lights and leave the room. Your reflection in the mirror decays in the bulb's afterglow. A distorted face, pinpoint eyes and a hairline mouth, wills itself to survive. There is perseverance and deterioration together in this moment. Is Kay's facelessness a conscious way to avoid the pain her mother went through? Or is it something imposed upon her by her generation's lack of a future? Can this identity be reclaimed? Would Kay even want to try? Or is holding on to what little she can ultimately all she can do? The world of NORCO leaves little impression that, as Harry Dubois can graffiti onto a wall, something beautiful is going to happen. The most beautiful thing that tries to happen is the launch of a rickety rocket built by disaffected dorks in a mall, but it results in nothing more than an explosion. NORCO was never trying to be the next Disco Elysium. It was started well before Disco Elysium came out, for different reasons and with different primary influences, but it stands alongside it as a supernaturally charged portrait of desolation and absurdity. It's a more hopeless portrait, featuring the obliteration of identity instead of the possibility of reconstruction. NORCO is an exploration of how people try to cope with this hopelessness through different downward spirals of unproductive efforts. Disco Elysium offers you at least some semblances of alternatives. But even so, in Disco Elysium you are no more capable of truly averting the larger political collision that is the Tribunal than Kay is of actually taking down Shield Oil. The power you have, the power Harry has in Disco Elysium, is over how to rebuild yourself. Kay has nothing to build with, so she can only search for her family, witness larger schemes collapse around her under their own weight, and maybe, possibly find peace with her brother, especially in the updated ending. All Kay can do is keep going and avoid the traps of false hope laid out around her. Part of what grabs me about this game is its mood and atmosphere, which I find scratches the same itch as Disco Elysium's atmosphere, but from a different angle. Let's just sit here for a little bit. Though not made with the intent of being companion pieces, when treated as such, the two games demonstrate different approaches to desolation and alienation. Disco Elysium emphasizes political reactions, largely through Harry Dubois' warped perspective, while characters like Joyce Messier, Evrart Clare, and a couple others are also highly politically savvy. They're featured alongside characters who do not have any conscious political slant and are simply trying to get by, including Kim Kitsuragi. NORCO strips away the explicit in-character political analysis, showing us an alternate to Martinez full of people who certainly suffer under the effects of politics, but are too focused on scraping by and searching for spiritual meaning to put words to those politics. And those words they can put are rarely used accurately. NORCO makes the sense of societal alienation more personal than Disco Elysium, even with a less expressive protagonist. Both of these games are melancholic, but the American Gothic flair of NORCO makes it far more than simply like Disco Elysium, and that's what makes it a great successor. However, the 1.5 update also removed one of my favorite small moments from the game, and I have no idea why. Originally, when you started up the game and got the prologue about Kay leaving NORCO for the first time, there was a section where you got to choose Kay's thoughts on Blake's reaction to her leaving, and if you choose the self-justifying "he would get over it," the narration would say, no, actually, he never did. Neither the player nor Kay gets to choose his reaction for him, and I found that pretty powerful. But as part of streamlining the intro, the dev team took this away, and I'm not a fan of that. Whatever, the game's still good. Near the end of Disco Elysium, there is an optional dream you can see that finally reveals the main source of Harry Dubois' emotional turmoil, or at least the most direct cause of his present strife. He loved his ex-fiancée Dora so fiercely, and took her leaving him so poorly, that he spiraled to the point of his memory-destroying bender that kicks off the game. His perception of her has warped so much in his mind, that her dream self has taken the form of the setting's mythic and historic figure Dolores Day. In this dream, she tells him,
"Real darkness has love for a face. The first death is in the heart, Harry."
Placing Slay the Princess in conversation with Disco Elysium makes the whole game feel almost like a yes and for this one line. This is a horror game, and this is a love story. Because love is not just darkness, but it so often can be. Slay the Princess is, as I've said in a video before, about love in all of its complicated totality, and it's also about the ways perception and love can influence each other. I don't think Abby Howard and Tony Howard Arias consciously made this whole game as a response to this one moment from Disco Elysium, but it certainly does work if considered that way, because the dream of Dora in the form of Dolores Day is an incomplete statement on the nature of love. How could it not be? It's the manifestation of one character's perspective, warped by self-hatred and substance abuse and mourning a woman who is not even dead, who can only view the good times as paradises to yearn for again. Slay the Princess can fully explore love, its good and its bad.
Consumption and betrayal, skepticism and blind devotion, rivalry and submission, terror and longing, pain and unfamiliarity. And at the heart of it all, an emotion that can only be described as,
"Are you okay?"
The narration trails off before identifying this meeting point. There are a few possible answers, but the one that makes the most sense to me is, of course, love. In this game, we see different versions of the princess that represent different elements of love and relationships. While they are most obviously framed in terms of romantic love, the fundamental dynamic in each one can apply to other forms of love as well. All of them are messy, many of them are toxic, but many others present peaceful resolutions and even joy achieved through trust and openness and honesty. Within the broader narrative, each chapter or sequence of chapters functions as a sort of parable about a different wrinkle within the whole of love. Take the uncritical bliss of a new relationship represented by the damsel, always eager to go along with everything as long as she's with you, to the point of total docility, which makes her vulnerable to a betrayal that leads her to become the burned gray, or the facade is broken so thoroughly nothing is left, or the relationship fades into crushing repetition that can, perhaps, still lead to the development of something flawed but truly real and more meaningful than ever before in Happily Ever After. In another route, it is you who is invariably broken into passivity by the moment of clarity, a lonely princess caused by your initial abandonment of her who drags you down to her despair through endless cycles of abuse. In another, she is a battle-hungry fighter who can only show affection through violence, addicted to the rush of intimate conflict and believing that such is the only way to experience the emotional highs of a relationship. In yet another, she is a practical problem solver willing to work cooperatively with a player who trusts her despite possible reservations. It's notable that the routes with more cooperative or even happy outcomes are more frequent in Chapter 3, while a route ending in Chapter 2 is more often one that has to end in some form of violence. This isn't a firm rule, of course, but out of the 10 Chapter 2s, only 3 of them have happier, more peaceful endings that are possible: Damsel, Prisoner, and Spectre. Meanwhile, in the 12 Chapter 3s, 6 of them have endings of full cooperation, and even the Apotheosis and the Fury have possible bright spots. I feel hesitant to fully count those because they're much more bittersweet, but if you want to count them, that brings the happy possibility to 8 out of 12. That's a huge difference, though if you split the 2 possible grays or the different versions of the razor, then maybe the ratio goes back down. Whatever, point being that it takes more work to get to a happy ending, especially if you start your Chapter 2 with betrayal, violence, or distrust. It could be tempting to look back at this and say the game conveys the message that love takes work and you just have to stick with it and tough it out and work on it and things will be okay. But that's not true, and in Slay the Princess it's certainly not applicable in all cases. Some damage can never be repaired, like with the Moment of Clarity and the Grey. Sometimes there is no healthy way to keep going together, only a way to find closure and move on, like with the Fury. Love doesn't always work out so neatly. Love does not always lead to positive outcomes. Love can be horrific in what it inspires us and our loved ones to do to each other. We can be possessive, vindictive, we can take advantage of the vulnerability a romantic partner shows to us, or be taken advantage of ourselves. And in these moments of intimate abuse, the hate that can result can be all the more potent for the misguided love it grew out of. Or, perhaps even more horrifying, that hatred may never even appear if love compels us to accept the unacceptable. Romantic devotion in one context can be dangerous obsession in another, or undignified sycophancy in a third. Real darkness has love for a face. But Slay the Princess knows that statement is incomplete, because love does not have to have darkness for a heart. The 6 happy endings as of the pristine cut all see the brighter side of love, the positive elements of it, leading the hero and the princess out of the dark. Certain voices better suited to empathizing with a particular princess can build common ground and understanding in routes like The Cage, while choosing trust and understanding, and in some cases forgiveness and empathy, leads to happy outcomes for the Spectre, the Princess and the Dragon, the Thorn, the Wild, the Den, and of course, Happily Ever After. Even though within the fiction of the game each princess is a part of a greater whole, it would be a mistake to view every route as collectively representative of one single relationship. After all, the hero's memory is a reset after each run. It makes much more sense to view these runs as isolated parables about the different elements of love they represent. The greater whole is not about one single relationship, it is the experience of love itself.
Perspectives meld together, and the breadth of my experience stretches to new corners. There are contradictions, conflicts in my nature, and there are familiarities that bind everything together.
Some experiences of love are healthy, some are unhealthy, and then they recede into the greater multitude when they end, however they end. By disconnecting the different routes as isolated vignettes within the greater journey of growing some sort of dynamic with the shifting mound, Slay the Princess allows its exploration of love to be more malleable and all-encompassing than a more closely connected through-line would have been. It gives each route the feeling of a what-if story, and one of the most powerful but malleable elements of love is how it interacts with our perception perception of it, or with the way others perceive us, or how we perceive ourselves. The game is not built to convey a single message about love so much as it's built to deeply explore its multitudes of experience as completely as a work of art unbound by the limitations of reality can. One of the most unique elements of Disco Elysium is the way it personifies the various skills, gives them all voices and personalities as they interject in Dubois' thought process to represent aspects of his fractured psyche. It's pretty fair to call this the most iconic part of Disco Elysium. It's certainly a highly exploitable meme template, therefore it's probably the part of the game hardest for a prospective successor to put an original spin on. Somehow, Slay the Princess pulls this off brilliantly. As you play, each new chapter and transformation of the princess adds a new persona to the main character's psyche alongside the narrator and the voice of the hero. Each new voice represents what the main character, the Long Quiet, and the princess both perceive him to be, based on how he acted before. These personas are not quite internal psychological traits like the Disco Elysium skills. They are manifestations of how the player's actions have shaped how the Long Quiet is seen by himself and the princess, manifestations of his role as perceived from an outsider. Just as doing everything to save a helpless and scared princess causes the Long Quiet to perceive her as a damsel, it causes them both to perceive him as a romantic hero, hence the voice of the smitten. Tricking the scared princess with false hope in a way that turns her into the betrayed and paranoid witch creates the voice of the opportunist, a compulsive backstabber who would be the physical embodiment of the Always Sunny playing both sides quote, if not for the fact that he doesn't actually have a body. Except in the Princess and the Dragon route, kind of.
I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
This external perception factor helps the Slay the Princess voices stand apart from the Disco Elysium skills. They reflect off their respective princesses, with some like the stubborn voice and the adversary princess being basically the same person. Sometimes this reflection is healthy, like how the voice of the broken helps connect to the cage because of their commonalities. Sometimes the similarity is toxic, as with the stubborn and the adversary. Sometimes they're toxic for being the opposite of each other, like the broken and the tower princess. But in all cases, the voices are shaped by external perception, just like the princesses. The voices also stand apart from Disco Elysium's personified skills because, frankly, the voices are simply acted with greater variation than the skills. Maybe this is because I first played Disco Elysium when it launched, before it had full voice acting, and got used to thinking of the skills as having much more varied inflections than actor Lenval Brown would eventually give them in the final cut. But I did feel a bit disappointed in that tonal uniformity. Brown does a great job as the overall narrator of Disco, and his tones are perfect for many of the skills, but I feel his delivery is a bit too flat for more energized skills like electrochemistry or savoir-faire.
Where in hell? Stop. You're only making it worse for him. You never help with anything.
When I was reading the drama skills lines in my own head, my mental delivery was much more similar to how Jonathan Sims performs the voice of the smitten in Slay the Princess.
We are breaking your cruel cycle and whisking her away to freedom.
But to jump back to defending Brown's performance, he does have 24 different skills, whereas Sims has half as many voices including the narrator, so Sims has fewer different types of performances to have to come up with. I wouldn't be surprised if Lenval Brown was directed to give a more uniform performance to avoid too much confusion if, say, visual calculus and logic sounded almost the same, but then Half-Light sounded wildly different. Also, while Final Cut Kuno's voice is ultimately a better performance for a fully voiced character, I do miss the sheer mania of the original Dot Major delivery.
Get the f*** out of here, face! You got something? Talk to me!
But anyway, in Disco Elysium, Harry's dream version of Dolores Day expresses disgust at his perception of her, warped by years of longing, guilt, heartbreak, and obsession. He knows it's grotesque, his subconscious makes her tell him so.
I am actually very ordinary, Harry. Below this gown and wreath, I have an ordinary soul and ordinary thoughts. The only thing inhuman about me is this thing you've made me into. I'm sorry for saying so, but I just hate it. What is this?
His conflation of Dora Ingerland with Dolores Day in his mind has turned his ex into a mythic figure of pain and suffering, strapping geopolitical baggage to someone he has been unable to move on from. It is dehumanizing worship, a manifestation of how badly his love for her has curdled into something eating him from the inside out. Slay the Princess, as with the darkness for a face line, takes this idea and runs with it. The way the princess warps based on how the Long Quiet perceives her, and how the Long Quiet becomes saddled with her vision of him, is played for subtle horror when it's made textually explicit. The narrator is terrified of the Long Quiet getting the wrong ideas in his head because he knows that can warp the princess into a monster, and in many routes, most routes, that's exactly what happens, resulting in princesses like the Apotheosis, the Beast, and the Wraith. But this, too, has a lighter side because it makes trust all the more powerful. Believing that the broken trust with the witch can be mended makes it so, and we get the wounded but cautiously forgiving Thorn. Unless you betray her again, you monster. There is a push and pull between Princess and Long Quiet as he perceives her, and she changes, and he reacts to her changes with new perceptions that can potentially change her again, if they don't escape into the in-between first. The Tower can run with his perception of her as powerful to completely subjugate him, but the damsel is so flimsy in the face of his perception that she can flatten into a scribble. Should the Long Quiet recognize his power over the princess's persona, he could conceivably dominate her entirely, but perhaps every stray thought about what she could be could get her to fight back. It's not just thinking, it's actually believing that changes the princess after all. And the narrator believes it's for the best that the Long Quiet does not have this power, because otherwise she could completely break free in her shifting mound form. The experience of love is, of course, not nearly so literally mercurial, but perception absolutely influences how relationships play out. A certain perception may not be able to actually change one's partner, but it can change the relationship itself, and that is part of what each iteration of the princess embodies. Less a type of partner than a type of relationship. A relationship can be sabotaged by jealousy or by unreasonable expectations. The entitled attitude that is the root of so many types of toxic relationships is a perception of ownership over one's partner. But a perception of equality and partnership can create that equal partnership. It's not all powerful, of course. It requires trust from all involved parties. And accordingly, each princess incarnation has the power to assert herself within each chapter, after adapting to the general shape of whatever perception has been imposed upon her. She is not just the Long Quiet's plaything, even in the more cooperative routes. The only exception to this is the damsel, but even she can develop her own desire beyond just make you happy if you choose to ask her to stay in the cabin. She is suddenly reluctant and begins the slow self-actualization process that leads into happily ever after, the most real and mature any princess gets. The princess's different embodiments of relationships is perfectly metaphorical in a way that feels emotionally true to what they represent without needing to have everything factually line up in a one-to-one allegory. It's enough that almost every chapter is some degree of conflict, of the princess and the Long Quiet needing to communicate in some way, beyond simply him reshaping her according to his own whims. Once she takes on a form for a chapter, she has her own agency within that form, and she and the Long Quiet must engage with how that perception forges a new relationship for a time, or alters whatever it was in Chapter 2. So, what does it mean that this quilt of love is woven using the embodiment of death, split into two beings, to act out its vignettes? In some ways, this emphasizes the possible darknesses of love, but it could also be seen as an acknowledgement of how relationships themselves die. Some of the details of the Long Quiet and the Shifting Mound don't match onto this idea very well, admittedly, being more relevant to the game's existentialist themes that I'm not really discussing in this video. But the nature of the Shifting Mound is as the embodiment of endless change and rebirth, and the Long Quiet is the endless stillness that comes after death, and both of those are still relevant to love. Experiences of love change with time, and love as a total experience is as multifaceted as the Shifting Mound herself. The death of one relationship, whatever kind it is, can lead to the birth of another, and we take lessons across them. But too much change too quickly results in unstable or shallow relationships. It means two partners or friends or family members or what have you can never truly get to know each other. Meanwhile, the Long Quiet can be seen as familiarity but also monotony. As a relationship evolves, it settles settles into a routine and familiarity, but it can also stagnate and wither. A whole experience of love requires both dynamism and stability. While this lesson plays out on a dramatic cosmic scale in the game's climax, it is also the intimate core of Happily Ever After. There is something tragic, though, about the cosmic facts of the game's plot that enable this complete exploration of love. After all, it is the ability of the princess and the Long Quiet to endlessly reset and try again from new perspectives that allows for this completeness. When they stumble into toxic mutual destruction, they are capable of stepping back and going again. No harm done. In between runs, when speaking with the Shifting Mound, she makes it clear that there are lessons to be learned from more villainous princesses, and she holds nothing against the Long Quiet for any violence that may occur. We mortals are not so lucky. We can be permanently damaged by a love experience like the Moment of Clarities or the Furies. We can end up as shattered as Harry Dubois, stuck in regret and unable to move on, even after 6 years or more. A god of death is, if you can believe it, more resistant to long-lasting trauma than a human being. One last thing to compare to Disco Elysium, the moment-to-moment writing. The expansive and highly reactive dialogue tree design is a clear similarity, though that's also just a good thing to go for in a game meant to allow a lot of player choice and expression in conversations. There's also a familiarity in the tone of much of the dialogue. The early exchanges where the narrator can say,
"Are you a monarchist? Is slaying a princess that much worse than slaying a fisherman or a miller or a seamstress? If anything, slaying a princess is much better than slaying a seamstress. Seamstresses contribute something of value to society."
Or where you can enthusiastically go all in on stabbing a monarch for the revolution, are perfectly in line with Disco's political comedy. Many of the Long Quiet's dorkier options feel like Harry's. And of course, for all that makes the voices distinct from the skills, both sets of mental characters argue and snipe at each other for minutes at a time in similar ways. So yeah, just like Norco, Slay the Princess manages to recapture much of the magic of Disco Elysium by spinning off into its own exploration of similar ideas and tones. It's far more than a knockoff. It is, aside from everything else it is on its own, a perfect demonstration of how to take obvious influences and reinvent them. In 1999, an isometric, story-heavy RPG came out to massive acclaim called Planescape Torment. It features an amnesiac, immortal man waking up in a strange city to set off on a journey of self-discovery. It was a remarkably well-written story with a very personal scope and narrative design that accounted for a lot of divergent player dialogue choices. The protagonist, the Nameless One, is an immortal being who has repeatedly died, had his memory reset, and lived new lives with new personalities. His goal is to rediscover his past, including the secret of how he became immortal and why he lost his memory, and finds himself pursued by shadowy, ghostly entities. Over the years, the game's status as a classic cemented, a titan of storytelling in the video game medium, from a time when video game narratives rarely aspired to much sophistication. It became a legend among RPG fans, and it was the benchmark for storytelling in games. In 2017, an isometric, story-heavy RPG came out with the overt intent to recapture the magic of Planescape Torment. It prided itself on directly involving many of the original Planescape developers. It was called Torment: Tides of Numenera, starring the so-called Last Castoff. The Last Castoff is the latest discarded body of the Changing God, a man who achieved immortality by continuously creating, possessing, and then abandoning bodies, with those bodies now free to develop their own identities. The Last Castoff is effectively an amnesiac, since their unique persona is newborn and they only have sporadic memories of the time when the Changing God was in their body. They also have a healing factor that makes them functionally immortal in most circumstances, and they are pursued by a shadowy, ghostly entity. This game goes out of its way to reference Planescape Torment as often as it can, including literally inserting a character who appeared in Planescape with the excuse that this character can do multidimensional travel. The most interesting parts of the game are its presentations of the throw-everything-at-the-wall, go-nuts, science fantasy Numenera tabletop setting it takes place in, and some of the strange characters who inhabit it. I'm particularly partial to the companion Eratus. The concept behind him is really neat, but it is weakest when it goes out of its way to mimic Planescape, which is unfortunately quite often. Tides of Numenera is generally regarded as alright, but it has never broken out of its niche. In 2019, an isometric, story-heavy RPG came out to critical acclaim called Disco Elysium. It features an amnesiac man waking up in a strange city to set off on a journey of self-discovery. It was a remarkably well-written story with a very personal scope and narrative design that accounted for a lot of divergent player dialogue choices. But crucially, it does not wallow in these superficial similarities to its inspiration. If you've played Planescape Torment, the influence is probably obvious, but the game stands on its own much better than Numenera, successfully synthesizing many more major inspirations. Tides of Numenera pitched itself as a recapturing of Planescape Torment above all else, but Disco Elysium simply used Planescape as one source of influence and still spun off to do its own thing, unbound by the expectation of living up to a direct predecessor. Now, Disco Elysium has the role Planescape Torment has enjoyed, and Dark Math Games' XXX Nightshift and Longdu's Hopetown and the husk wearing the skin of Zom's Project C4 all could be poised to not be the next Disco Elysium, but the next Tides of Numenera. I'm less confident that Summer Eternal and Red Info will fall into the same trap, but they easily may. Meanwhile, it is not the games trying to be like Disco Elysium, but those taking inspiration for their own purposes that will really carry the torch. I was tempted to add a section to this video about Obsidian's Pentiment, a game following the artist Andreas Mahler as he investigates murder in the Renaissance-era German town of Tassing. It, too, has an identity all its own, and it's much more directly inspired by Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose than Disco Elysium anyway. I ended up not including the Pentiment section because really the only part of the game that felt like Disco Elysium to me were Andreas' dream sequences. While NORCO also was not that overtly inspired by Disco Elysium, it still feels much more similar throughout than Pentiment does. But regardless, Pentiment demonstrates another way influence and similarity can spread. When people describe the ways artists borrow from each other, this is the good version, the not plagiarism version. Remixing ideas, themes, and tones in ways that don't just blatantly iterate, finding aesthetics and structures that convey the same sensibilities in new ways. Slay the Princess may be like Disco Elysium, but about a princess and a hero who is tasked with killing her, but there is so much more beyond that simple elevator pitch. Same with NORCO, so much more than like Disco Elysium, but set in Louisiana about a vagrant girl looking for her missing brother. NORCO and Slay the Princess, and Pentiment, are aided in their ability to stand apart by their dramatically different presentation styles. It makes it easier to see them as influenced rather than copying compared to Esoteric Ebb and Rue Valley, which have quite similar UI design. But even those games take pains to be their own spins, or at least they seem to. I withhold final judgment on where they land in the copycat to successor spectrum because they aren't out yet. Neither is XXX Nightshift or Hopetown or Project C4, and Summer Eternal and Red Info haven't even publicly named their successor efforts yet. If they all turn out well, then we get 5 cool new games. But if they rely too heavily on their ties to Disco Elysium, then the comparisons could prove fatal to their reputations. And to be clear, my point is not hire fans or fans get this right more than the original creatives, just because that happened to be the case with the Numenera Disco comparison. Fans fall into this trap constantly too. My point is simply that from a creative side, regardless of who is doing the creation, there's a huge difference between, hey, this thing from this other work is cool, what if we did this with it, and let's make the next version of this other thing. If you choose the latter, even if the other thing is your own older work, you will be forever stuck in its shadow. And also, I gotta slip in some quick AI bad into this. The kind of remixing I've been praising in Slay the Princess and NORCO are things that LLMs could never do, not on their own at least. Thank you so much for watching. Here's the apparently obligatory request to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell, and check out my Patreon. My Patreon has private Q&A videos, script previews, and a recently added pseudo-blog for backers of every tier where I write short mini-essays about media I don't plan on doing actual videos on. So if that sounds cool to you, or you just want to help support me beyond the standard YouTube stuff, you can join these patrons on screen now. Goodbye, and have a good one.